The Viking mindset. Why were they so fearless? When people face up to death outnumbered, surrounded, no way out, most would panic. But the Vikings? They laughed. What made the Vikings different? That's the question Professor Tom Shippey, an expert on Viking history, once posed to his students. Then, he answered it himself. It was their unique way of thinking, the Viking mindset. Unlike many cultures that feared dying, the Vikings embraced it. They believed in fate and saw death as just another step toward Valhalla, a warrior's paradise. And they didn't just fight bravely, they mocked their enemies and refused to show fear, no matter the odds. To truly understand this fearless spirit, let's dive into some of the most legendary last moments in Viking history. The death of Ragnar Lothbrok, legend or truth. Ragnar Lothbrok is one of the most famous Viking warriors, but his story is filled with myths. Some sagas say he was the son of a Swedish king and even fought a dragon. But one tale stands out, the story of his final journey to England. Seeking glory and riches, Ragnar sailed to Northumbria, but fate was not on his side. His ship wrecked, and he was captured by King Ella, a powerful ruler who saw him as a threat. Instead of a quick death, Ella chose something cruel. He threw Ragnar into a pit of venomous snakes. Even as the snakes bit him, Ragnar did not scream or beg. Instead, he spoke his final words. The little pigs would squeal if they knew how the old boar had died. This was not a cry for help, it was a warning. The little pigs were his sons, and he was telling Ella that they would come for revenge. And he was right. In 865, Ragnar's sons, known as the Ragnarssons, led a massive Viking army into England. They burned towns, crushed Northumbria, and captured King Ella. According to legend, they executed him using the gruesome blood eagle, a Viking punishment where the ribs were split open and the lungs were pulled out like wings. Some historians believe Ragnar's snake pit death was just a story added later to justify the Viking invasion. But real or not, the tale became legendary, shaping Viking history and leaving a lasting mark on England. The vengeance of the Ragnarssons, Ragnar's death, was just the beginning. When his sons heard how he had died, their rage turned into a storm of vengeance. In 865 AD, they gathered the Great Heathen Army, the largest Viking force ever seen, and set sail for England. Nothing could stop them. They burned towns, tore down fortresses, and left destruction wherever they went. Their fury crushed East Anglia and Northumbria, bringing fear to all who stood in their way. Finally, King Ella, the man who had thrown Ragnar into the snake pit, was captured. There was no escape. According to legend, Ragnar's sons gave him a death as brutal as any Viking tale. They used the blood eagle, a horrific execution where the ribs were cut from the spine and the lungs were pulled out like wings. No one knows if the blood eagle truly happened or if it was just a story to make their revenge sound even more terrifying. But one thing is certain, Ragnar was avenged, and the world would never forget his name. Hrolf Kraki, the hero of Denmark. Hrolf Kraki was one of Denmark's greatest kings, often called the Arthur of the North. He ruled over Lejre, where a grand hall gathered the bravest warriors. Hrolf wasn't just powerful, he was sharp-minded, a leader who always fought at the front lines. But fate is merciless. One morning, before the sun had even risen, his cousin Hjorvard launched a surprise attack. Hrolf and his loyal warriors fought fiercely, refusing to surrender. One by one, they fell until only one remained, Voger, the weakest boy in the court. Hjorvard smirked. "You are no threat. Swear loyalty to me, and I will let you live." Voger nodded, but the moment Hjorvard handed him a sword, he drove it straight into his chest. The mighty usurper collapsed, and Vogr became the most unlikely avenger in Viking legend. For centuries, the story of Hrolf Kraki was dismissed as just another myth. But then, archaeologists uncovered the ruins of a massive hall in Lesre, the very place he was said to have ruled. Perhaps, after all, legends hold more truth than we think. Jomsvikings, the legendary warriors. The Jomsvikings were a legendary group of mercenaries, known for their strict discipline and unbreakable spirit. They accepted only the strongest warriors, regardless of where they came from. But in 986, during the Battle of Hjörungavágr, the Jomsvikings met their match. After being defeated, the captured warriors were executed one by one. Yet, instead of begging for mercy, they faced death with pride and even humor. One warrior, as he was led to the execution block, laughed and said, "I only regret there's no snow today, so my head won't roll farther after it's chopped off." The executioners couldn't help but laugh, but they still carried out the sentence. Another prisoner, just before his beheading, told the executioner to step back so he could swing harder. When the executioner did so, the prisoner suddenly leapt up, twisted the executioner's arm, and grabbed the weapon. Before the executioner could react, the prisoner struck him down. Jarl Erik, the enemy leader, laughed and said, "Men like you deserve to live." And with that, he spared the remaining Jomsvikings. Years later, archaeologists uncovered a mass grave where dozens of Jomsvikings had been executed, proving that the legend was real. Olaf Haraldsson, the Golden King before becoming King of Norway, and later a Saint Olaf Haraldsson, was a Viking warrior who traveled across Europe. When he took the throne, he was determined to bring Christianity to Norway, but his mission angered many pagan nobles, sparking rebellions. In 1030, after years in exile, Olaf returned to reclaim his crown. Waiting for him was a massive army of farmers and pagan warriors. Knowing he was outnumbered, Olaf turned to the poet Thormod and asked for a battle poem. Thormod then recited a solemn verse about Rolf Kraki, a king who had fought to his last breath. As the poem ended, Olaf and his men charged into battle, but fate had already been decided. Struck down by those who once called him king, Olaf fell on the battlefield. Thormod, though gravely wounded, was captured and brought to the enemy's tent. A soldier shot an arrow into his chest. Instead of crying out, he chuckled and said, "That must be a gift from my king." Then, with a final breath, he collapsed, carrying the Viking spirit to the very end. Harald Hardrada, the last Viking Harald Hardrada, was more than just a Viking warrior. He was a conqueror. He had fought across Europe, served in the elite Varangian Guard of Constantinople, and claimed the throne of Norway. But one ambition still burned in his heart: England. In 1066, Harold and his army landed on English shores, quickly claiming a decisive victory. But just days later, King Harold Godwinson and his forces appeared unexpectedly at Stamford Bridge. The Vikings were caught off guard. Harold, unarmored, stood in the thick of battle like a true Viking. With his sword, he cut down enemy after enemy until an arrow pierced his throat. The mighty king collapsed, and with him the Viking dream of conquering England. But the story didn't end there. Just 3 weeks later, Harold Godwinson, the very man who had defeated Harold, was slain by William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings. Had the Vikings not weakened the English forces, history might have unfolded differently. With Harald Hardrada's death, the Viking Age came to an end. But his legacy and the battle that reshaped Europe would never be forgotten. For the Vikings, death was not an end, it was a test of honor. They faced it with courage, humor, and an unbreakable will. And even after 1,000 years, their legacy still inspires us. But here's a question for you. If you lived in the Viking Age, how would you face your final moments? With fear or with a smirk?